Sell it, veteran, or watch it bury you.
Brent Halvorson stood on the porch of Granite Pass Snow Station, one hand resting against the old cabin door. Rain ran off Reed Sutter's patched army jacket as Ash stepped beside him.
This station is mine,
Reed said. Brent smiled.
You bought this rotten shack for $20. A man sleeps behind laundromat. His laundromat doesn't get to own a mountain.
Reed didn't move. Then Ash went still. He turned away from Brent, pushed past the doorway, and lowered his nose beneath the dead radio desk. One sharp scratch cut through the room. Brent stopped smiling. Reed had bought a place everyone called worthless. But Granite Pass had been hiding something far deeper than anyone in Larch Creek understood. Look, to understand what happened next, you have to know how Reed Sutter spent his last $25. Reed Sutter woke before sunrise because the cold had found its way through every seam of the old pickup. It sat behind the laundromat in Larch Creek, Montana, angled between a rusted dumpster and a row of yellow weeds stiff with frost. The engine had been off since midnight to save gas, and the windows had fogged from the inside, blurring the rain, pavement, and weak neon of the 24-hour wash sign. His right hand was wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had gone cold hours earlier. His left hand rested on the worn sleeve of an army jacket folded across his lap. In the passenger seat, Ash lifted his head the moment Reed moved. The German Shepherd had the kind of eyes that did not ask questions because they had already decided to stay. Reed breathed out slowly and watched the fog on the windshield tremble. 41 years old, a veteran, once trusted to build roads where there were none, and now counting the morning by how long he could sit before the cold reached his knees. He reached into his wallet and counted again, although he already knew the answer. $25. One wrinkled 21.5. No coins worth mentioning. Enough for gas to leave Larch Creek. Not enough to arrive anywhere better. Outside, rain began tapping on the roof, thin and steady, the kind of rain that made a man feel poorer because it touched everything he owned at once. Reed waited until the laundromat lights flickered brighter, then stepped out, stretched his back, and let Ash down from the cab. The dog shook once under the parking lot light, then pressed his shoulder against Reed's leg. Reed did not say thank you. He never did with Ash. Some things were understood. By 7, the public library had opened, and Reed went in because the building had heat, and nobody charged you for sitting quietly if you looked like you were reading. Helen Ward, the librarian, gave him a careful nod from behind the front desk. She was not unkind. She had let him sit there during bad weather, and once set aside old newspapers when Ash slept under his chair. But she used the soft, cautious voice people saved for a man they thought was close to breaking. Reed hated that voice more than he hated the cold. He walked to the county bulletin board near the hallway, mostly to keep his hands busy. There were notices for used snow tires, a church supper, a cracked wood stove for sale, and half-covered beneath them, a sheet of county paper curling at one corner. Granite Pass Snow Station. Abandoned county property. Starting bid, $25. No road access guaranteed. Reed read it once, then again slower. There was a faded black and white photograph clipped to the bottom of the notice. A low wooden cabin stood in a clearing, its metal roof pale as old tin, a snow measuring pole beside the porch, pine trees rising behind it like a wall. Something in Reed's chest shifted. Not hope exactly, because hope was too bright a word for what he felt. It was more like recognition. 4 walls. A roof, a stovepipe, a place that, if it belonged to him, no one could ask him to move along. Helen came up beside him with a stack of returned books in her arms. "That place," she said, following his eyes. "Reed. Nobody's touched Granite Pass in over 20 years. He looked at her. Why? Road washed out in places. Roof may be bad, no power, no water, no reliable signal. County closed it after the snow survey went automatic back in 2003. They've been trying to get it off the books ever since. She paused, not wanting to wound him and doing it anyway. It's not really a home. Reed looked back at the photograph. Maybe not to them, Helen sighed softly. The way people sigh when they think they are watching someone choose trouble. Winter's close. I know. You'd have to hike in. I know that, too. Ash, who had been lying near Reed's boot, suddenly stood. His ears rose. He placed both front paws against the edge of the bulletin table and stared at the photograph. Not at Reed, not at Helen, at the cabin. His nose worked once, twice, catching the faint smell of damp paper, old storage boxes, and something metallic clipped inside the county folder. A low growl moved through his throat, quiet enough that only Reed and Helen heard it. Reed turned slowly toward him. Ash. The dog did not look away from the picture. Helen grew still. What's gotten into him? Reed did not answer. He had seen Ash find a buried glove under snow, a lost trail under rain, a man's scent on a jacket washed twice. The dog did not react without reason, but this was still only a county folder, a faded photograph, and a dead station nobody wanted. Reed's fingers tightened around the edge of the notice. By noon, because the disposal listing had been open for months and closed that day with no other bidder, the county clerk took his $25 with the flat expression of a woman who had processed stranger things and expected most of them to end badly. There had been no other bids in all the months the county had tried to get rid of it. There was no ceremony, no handshake that meant anything, just a stamped receipt, a thin folder, and Reed Sutter's name printed under the words "Successful Bidder." When he stepped back out of the library, the rain had not stopped. It silvered the sidewalk, darkened his jacket, and gathered in Ash's fur along the shoulders. Reed held the folder under his coat, as if it were something fragile. He had spent his last $25. He had bought a snow station 10 miles from the nearest good road, a place the county called abandoned, and Helen Ward called not really a home. He did not know if he had bought shelter, a burden, or the beginning of a mistake large enough to swallow him. Beside him, Ash looked toward the mountains hidden beyond the rain, standing so still that Reed found himself looking that way too. Reed had always understood broken things better than broken people. A washed-out road, a sagging porch, a culvert clogged with mud, none of them pretended to be fine. They simply failed in ways a man could study, measure, and fix. Before something broke, people drove over it without thinking. After it broke, they cursed it. In the middle, there was a man with a shovel, a pry bar, a roll of wire, and enough patience to make the world passable again. For years, Reed had been that man. In the small town scattered through western Montana, people called him when runoff ate the shoulder of a gravel road, when a footbridge began to lean, when a shed roof bowed under wet snow, or when wind tore open a fence. Reed liked arriving at a problem and leaving behind proof that his hands had mattered. A ditch cut clean, a post reset, a roof braced, a road usable again. There was comfort in work that had a before and an after. In the Army, his work had been much the same, only farther from home and under skies that did not care what any man had planned. He was not the one telling stories at bars about glory. He did not collect attention. He worked behind the movement of other people, opening routes, reinforcing soft ground, diverting water, laying temporary crossings where wheels would sink without them. Rain, mud, heat, wind, the sour smell of wet canvas, the dull ache of carrying tools all day, these were things he understood. He grew used to being needed without being remembered. People remembered the convoy getting through and the road opening by morning. They rarely remembered the men who had worked all night to make it happen. Reed had not minded then. He had a job, a place, a clear line between useful and useless. Coming home blurred that line. Civilian life had no map he trusted. No one handed him a task at dawn and told him where to stand. There were forms, interviews, short-term jobs, polite refusals, and rooms that cost more each year. Reed did what he could. He repaired fences outside ranch properties, cleared deadfall from trails, patched roofs after storms, hauled lumber for a contractor who paid in cash on Fridays when he remembered. He saved quietly. He spent little. He kept his boots by the door and his tools in the truck, because a man could lose a lot and still feel like himself if he knew where his tools were. Then came the roof job in November. Nothing dramatic enough to make news. Just a patch of old frost on a metal seam. One bad step, a fall that left his shoulder damaged and his ribs sore for weeks. The contractor found someone else. The landlord waited less than the doctor said Reed needed. One missed week became two. Two became a notice folded under the door. Reed moved his things into the pickup on a Tuesday afternoon while the sky threatened snow. At first he told himself it was temporary. A few nights, maybe a week. He knew how to endure discomfort. But discomfort has a way of becoming address, and after a while people stopped asking where he was staying. They already knew. Ash came into his life when both of them had been quietly removed from the systems that once gave them purpose. The volunteer search team had lost funding. The county could no longer justify feed, gear, training, and insurance for a dog they used only a few times a year. Ash had followed lost trails in rain, tracked scent through snow, and stayed beside exhausted hikers until help arrived. But the county ledger had no line for loyalty. Reed heard about him from a mechanic who knew someone who knew the handler. He went to see the dog behind a storage building near the old rescue shed, and Ash looked at him without excitement, without begging, without judgment. That was what Reed remembered most. The dog simply looked, as if taking a measure no one else had bothered to take. Reed thought he was giving Ash a second chance. Within weeks he understood the truth. Ash made him wait before the cab grew too cold. Ash made him walk even when he wanted to sit in silence until dark. Ash made him buy food on days when Reed would have skipped his own meal. Ash listened for weather, for footsteps, for changes in Reed's breathing. The dog turned survival into a routine, and routine into a thin, stubborn kind of hope. Larch Creek knew Reed in pieces, and most people never bothered to assemble them. The veteran with the old pickup, the man who slept behind the laundromat when the nights were bad, the one with the German shepherd, the quiet man at the corner table in Marin Cole's diner, nursing the cheapest coffee on the menu, and leaving before the breakfast crowd filled the room. Some people were kind in small ways. A refill not charged, a bag of day-old rolls set near the counter, a nod that did not ask for explanation. Others looked away too fast, or lowered their voices as he passed, as if losing a room and losing worth were the same thing. Reed never corrected them. He had learned that a man could spend the little strength he had explaining himself and still not be believed. It was easier to keep his truck clean, keep Ash fed, keep his tools wrapped in an oiled cloth behind the seat, and wait for the next thing that could be fixed. That evening, after buying Granite Pass Snow Station with the last $25 he owned, Reed sat behind the steering wheel with the county folder resting across it. Rain crawled down the windshield in crooked lines. The laundromat hummed behind him. Ash sat upright in the passenger seat, watching him with the patient attention of a creature that expected movement. Reed ran his thumb over the stamped receipt, over his own name printed there as if paper could make a thing true. "Might just be a bad roof," he said softly. Ash blinked once. Reed looked toward the dark shape of the mountains beyond town, hidden now behind rain and low cloud. But a bad roof is still a place to start. Reed packed the way a man packs when he knows the mountains do not forgive carelessness. He did not bring what he wanted. He brought what might keep him and Ash alive long enough to decide whether Granite Pass was a home or a mistake. The old backpack took the rope first, then the hatchet, a folding knife, a water filter, flashlights, matches, a lighter wrapped in plastic, beans, jerky, rice, a dented cookpot, spare socks, a faded rain shell, and the county folder sealed inside a freezer bag. He added a screwdriver, pliers, a short pry bar, a handful of nails, and a roll of black tape because a man with tape and nails was not helpless, not completely. Ash stood beside the truck and watched every item go in, patient but alert, his coat lifting whenever the wind came down the street. Reed fastened the dog's old canvas harness, checked both side pouches, then tucked in Ash's food, bandages, and the collapsible bowl. "Not much of a moving crew," Reed said. Ash looked at him as if the size of the crew had never mattered. They drove out of Larch Creek before most of town had turned on its kitchen lights, using the last gas already sitting in the pickup's tank. The pickup rattled along the county road, past hayfields gone yellow, past a closed sawmill, past mailboxes leaning under the weight of old snow seasons. The paved road ended without ceremony. After that came a logging road washed pale by years of runoff. Reed drove as far as he could, slow over ruts, slower over stone, until the road disappeared under a tangle of fallen pine and wet earth where part of the slope had slid down across it. He turned off the engine. The silence after the old truck stopped was large enough to make him hear his own breathing. He sat there for a moment, with both hands on the wheel. That truck had been a bedroom, a closet, a shelter, a place to hide from weather and people. It was a poor home, but it had been his. Reed locked the doors, checked them twice, then stood looking back at it longer than he meant to. Ash waited at the edge of the washed-out road, facing uphill. The first miles were not dramatic. That made them harder in a way. Mud gathered on Reed's boots until each step felt borrowed from someone stronger. Cold rain worked under his collar and down the back of his neck. Pine branches slapped at his sleeves. The pack pulled at the sore places in his shoulder. The trail was not really a trail at first, only the memory of one, a narrow seam through wet grass and loose rock. Reed moved carefully, not fast. He had learned long ago that mountains punished pride before they punished weakness. At the first creek, he knelt and touched the water. It was so cold it made his fingers ache. The old plank bridge had lost 2 boards near the center, and the remaining wood was dark with rot. Reed tied a rope around a standing pine and crossed first, testing each plank before calling Ash over. On the far side, Ash shook rain from his coat and immediately lowered his nose to the ground. That became the rhythm of the day. Reed watched the slope, the water, the sky. Ash watched everything else. The dog stopped at a rusted marker, half swallowed by huckleberry brush. He stopped again beside a length of cable emerging from the dirt like an old vein. Later, he found a moss-covered sign Reed almost missed, County Snow Survey Route. The letters were faded, but still there. Farther up, a metal hook had been driven into a pine trunk, the bark grown thick around it, holding it in place like the tree had decided to keep the secret. Reed touched it with 2 fingers. Granite Pass had not been a lonely cabin someone forgot by accident. It had been part of something, a system, a route, a set of hands reaching through weather from one place to another. That thought stayed with him as the afternoon dimmed. They did not reach the station that day. 2 miles short of it, Reed found a small outbuilding crouched beside the trail, no bigger than a tool shed, with a slanted roof and a door hanging from one hinge. It smelled of damp boards, mouse nests, and old oil, but it blocked the wind. Reed cleared a corner with his boot, spread his sleeping bag, and shared the last dry jerky with Ash. Dinner was cold beans eaten from the can with a folding knife. Rain ticked through 3 places in the roof. Now and then, a drop struck Reed's sleeve or Ash's back, and the dog would twitch without fully sleeping. Near midnight, Reed woke to a low sound in Ash's throat. The dog was upright, staring through the broken doorway toward the dark slope above them. Reed held his breath and listened. No footsteps, no engine, no voices, only wind moving through pine and the slow drip of water from the roof. Still, Ash did not lie down for a long time. At dawn, the rain thinned to mist. Reed's legs were stiff when he stood, and his shoulder complained under the pack, but the air had changed. It smelled higher now, colder, thinner, with snow somewhere above them, though none had fallen where they stood. They climbed the last stretch through lodgepole pine and gray stone. Then the trees opened. Granite Pass Snow Station appeared slowly, as if it had been waiting to see whether they would make it. A low wooden cabin stood in a clearing of dead grass and wet rock. Its metal roof had gone silver with rust. The front door leaned slightly inward. 3 windows stared out, cloudy with dust. A small shed sagged to the left, and beside the porch a tall snow measuring pole stood alone, marked in black numbers faded by years of weather. Reed did not smile, he did not speak. He simply stood there with rain on his face, and Ash at his side, looking at the first thing he had owned in months that was not on wheels. It was damaged, it was cold, it was farther from help than any sensible man would choose, but it was still standing, and for Reed Sutter, that was enough to make him step forward. Reed stood on the porch for a while before he opened the door, not because he was afraid, but because some places deserved a moment before a man put his hand on them. The cabin's lock was brown with rust, the kind of rust that looked soft until you touched it, and found it still holding. Reed worked the key County had given him into the old hardware, turned it once, felt nothing, then turned it again with steady pressure. The lock gave with a dry click that sounded too loud in the clearing. Ash stood beside him, ears forward, body still. Reed pushed the door with his shoulder. It opened inward a few inches, stopped against grit on the floor, then moved with a long scrape that made dust lift in the gray light. He had expected damage, maybe animals, broken bottles, a place torn open by weather and bored strangers. What he found was stranger than ruin. Order. Dust lay over everything, thick and patient, but nothing had been thrown around. A heavy wooden table sat in the center of the room as if waiting for a map. A black wood stove stood against the left wall. A narrow iron bed frame rested in the back corner beneath 2 folded wool blankets stiff with age. Near the far wall sat the dead radio desk, all knobs, wires, and a microphone on a hook. In the right corner stood a tall gray steel cabinet, its surface dulled by years of cold. On the wall above it, a topographic map of Granite Pass had yellowed almost to the color of old bone. Reed stepped inside and stopped again. The air smelled of dry wood, iron, cold ash, old nesting dust, and paper that had been shut away too long. Reed had been inside dead buildings before. They smelled open, invaded, used up, but this place smelled sealed, as if it had been waiting instead of rotting. Ash entered after him without making a sound. The dog did not wander the way he usually did in a new place. He moved with his nose low, passing the stove, the bed frame, the table, then stopping at the steel cabinet. A low breath moved through him. Reed heard it and looked over. "You feel it too," he said, though he was not sure what he meant. On the table lay a weather log, its green cover faded, one corner chewed by damp. Reed brushed dust away with the side of his hand and opened it carefully. Page after page held tight handwriting, dates, snow depth, wind direction. temperature, road notes, creek level, remarks about ice load and thaw patterns. Whoever had kept it had written like a person who believed small details could matter more than big speeches. Reed turned to the final page. March 18, 2003. Snowpack unstable. Road crew delayed. Cabinet sealed. He read the words once, then again. Cabinet sealed. They had not written cabinet locked. Not cabinet full, sealed. The difference sat in Reed's mind like a stone in a boot. He crossed to the gray cabinet. Faded lettering still clung to the upper door. Granite Pass Records, do not remove. Reed pulled the handle. It did not move. He could have forced it with the pry bar in his pack. The metal was old. The hinges were tired. But his hand stayed on the handle without pulling harder. There was something about the room. The straight-backed chair tucked under the table, the cup turned upside down near the stove, the log closed on a final warning that made breaking in feel wrong. Whoever had left this place had not abandoned it carelessly. They had closed it with intention. Ash, however, had not finished. The dog backed away from the cabinet and returned to the radio desk. He sniffed along the legs, then under the cracked rubber mat that lay beneath it. Reed crouched, took the edge of the mat, and peeled it back. Dust lifted in a gray sheet. Underneath, 4 square screw marks showed in the floorboards, nearly hidden by age. The boards around them were darker, as if something had once been fastened there, removed and put back with care. Ash lowered his nose to the seam between 2 planks and held it there. Reed touched the wood. Solid, maybe, maybe not. He could feel his curiosity rising, sharp and hungry, but he let it pass. The light outside was thinning. The mountains did not care about mysteries after dark. He set the mat back down, stood, and began with what mattered first. He checked the chimney with a flashlight. He cleared old ash from the stove. He found a gap in the window and covered it with a square of tarp. He swept one corner of the floor clean enough for his sleeping bag. It took an hour to coax the first fire into the stove, and even then the warmth came slowly, as if the cabin had forgotten how to receive it. Reed sat on the floor with his back against the wall, Ash near the door, both of them watching the steel cabinet in the corner. Outside, wind dragged itself over the metal roof and through the pines. Inside, the fire clicked softly. The cabinet stood silent in the dim orange light, not like a box of records, but like an old man deciding whether the stranger in his room had earned the story. Morning came gray and narrow, the kind of mountain morning that did not arrive all at once, but seeped through the windows, through the cracks in the boards, through the thin smoke smell left in the stove. Reed woke with his shoulders stiff and his boots still damp near the firebox. Ash was already awake, lying near the door with his head up, watching the steel cabinet as if it had breathed sometime in the night. Reed sat up, rubbed both hands over his face, and looked at the room the way a man looks at work he has no right to postpone. The cabinet could wait. The roof could not. That was the first thing Granite Pass taught him. A mystery did not matter much if rain was falling through the ceiling onto the floorboards. He ate 2 mouthfuls of cold beans, fed Ash, then started with the broom behind the stove. He swept the floor slowly, listening to the boards under his boots. After that, he cleared the drainage trench behind the cabin, pulling out packed pine needles until black water began to move again. He checked the porch next. 2 boards had gone soft near the steps, their edges dark and swollen. He cut away what he could with his knife and braced the worst section with a scrap of lumber from the shed. The shed leaned worse than it had from below. Inside he found a rusted coffee can full of old nails, a coil of wire, 3 bent hinges, and a sheet of roofing tin tucked behind a stack of broken snow stakes. None of it was much. All of it mattered. Ash stayed close through the morning, circling the cabin, Nosing at the rotten boards Reed dragged out, once carrying a short piece of punky wood in his mouth and dropping it by the shed as if he had decided to help. Near noon, while Reed was on one knee tightening wire around a loose porch support, Ash returned to the radio desk inside and gave one sharp scratch at the floor. Reed heard it through the open door. He went in, wiped his hands on his pants, and watched the dog lower his nose to the seam beneath the rubber mat. Reed lifted the mat again. The square screw marks were there, the same as before, but now in daylight he saw a small plug of wood set between two planks. It was darker than the boards around it. He eased the tip of his knife beneath the edge and worked carefully, not prying hard enough to split it. The plug came loose with a dry little pop. Beneath it was a narrow space, and inside that space sat a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Reed took it out and set it on the table. Ash stood beside him, still as weather. The cloth had stiffened with age, but it peeled back. Inside was a key and a folded piece of paper. Reed opened the paper with the caution of a man handling something more fragile than it looked. The handwriting was plain, slanted slightly to the right, for the one who fixes the roof before opening the records. Reed read the line twice, then sat down without meaning to. It was not a warning exactly. It was a test, but not the kind meant to keep a thief out. It was the kind meant to learn what sort of person had come through the door. Anyone could be curious. Anyone could want what was locked away. But not everyone would stop first to keep the rain out. Reed put the key in his shirt pocket and left it there. He did not open the cabinet. For the rest of the day he worked on the roof. He dragged the old sheet of tin from the shed, flattened it under his boot, and carried it up the short ladder. The roof groaned under his weight but held. He used old nails where he could, wire where nails would not bite, and the tarp from his pack over the worst seam. It was ugly work, temporary work, the kind of work no one photographed. But by late afternoon, when the first light rain began to fall, Reed stood inside the cabin and listened. Rain tapped the metal roof. Rain ran into the trench behind the wall. Rain moved around the cabin instead of through it. For the first time, nothing dripped onto the center of the floor. Ash lay beneath the table with his eyes half closed, his tail giving one slow thump when Reed looked at him. Only then did Reed take the key from his pocket. The cabinet lock resisted, then turned with a heavy scrape. Inside were not gold bars or jewelry or anything that belonged in a story told by greedy men. There were snow logs stacked by year, avalanche maps rolled in paper sleeves, black and white photographs of road crews standing beside plows, a leather envelope, a canvas pouch wrapped in wax paper, and a small wooden box. Reed opened the pouch first because it was heavy. Inside were bundles of cash, old but clean, marked and wrapped with care. $42,000. Reed lowered himself to the floor. He had carried bridge timbers, sandbags, tool chests, men heavier than himself when the ground was bad. But nothing had ever made his hands shake like that canvas pouch. Still, after a long minute, his eyes moved past the money to the leather envelope. Written across it in the same careful hand were the words, "To whoever cared enough to open this place gently." Reed did not open the leather envelope right away. The money sat in the canvas pouch beside his boot. $42,000, wrapped in careful bundles. More cash than he had ever seen in one place. And still the room seemed to gather itself around something smaller. A name written by hand, a sealed envelope. A sentence meant for someone who had not arrived for more than 20 years. Ash lay close enough that his shoulder touched Reed's knee, his eyes half open, watching the envelope as if it carried a scent older than dust. Reed wiped his hands on his pants before he picked it up. The leather was dry but not brittle, darkened at the edges where fingers had handled it long ago. Inside was a folded letter, several pages, written in blue ink that had faded but not disappeared. The first line read, "My name is Ellis Rowan, and if you are reading this, Granite Pass has finally let someone in." Reed leaned back against the cabinet and began to read. Ellis had been the last snow watcher assigned to Granite Pass. 16 winters, he wrote. 16 springs of thaw-water measurements, 16 autumns patching screens and checking the stovepipe before the first hard freeze. His job was plain enough to sound small when written on a county form. Measure snowpack, record wind, track meltwater, watch the slopes, keep radio contact with the road crew. But Ellis wrote about it the way a man writes about work that has entered his bones. He knew which ridge loaded first when the wind turned west. He knew the creek would speak differently under ice before the road below became unsafe. He knew the old bridge on the lower grade could look solid in morning sun and still tremble under a plow by dusk. If he did his work right, he wrote, nobody noticed. A road closed before trouble, a crew delayed before the slope gave, a driver told to wait in town one more night. People went home safe and called it luck, or weather, or common sense. They did not call it Ellis Rowan, and Ellis did not seem to mind. There was no bitterness in the letter. That was what made it harder for Reed to read. Ellis did not ask to be admired. He did not sound angry at being forgotten. He sounded like a man who had accepted silence, but had never mistaken it for emptiness. He wrote about mornings when snow buried the porch, nights when the radio signal broke apart, and days when the entire logbook entry was only 3 lines. Wind shifted, snow heavy, do not open road. Reed could see him there without trying, a man alone in this same room, fire low, pencil in hand, listening to mountains most people only drove through. In 2003, Ellis wrote, "The county closed Granite Pass. Automatic gauges were cheaper. Digital reports were faster. A sensor did not need coffee, firewood, repairs, or a paycheck." Ellis did not hate the machines. He said they would do some things well. But there were things a machine did not know because no one had taught it to stand still long enough. The sound of water running under snow. The gray color a slope took on before it moved. The smell of wet earth when the ground loosened beneath frozen grass. The slight give in a bridge rail under a bare hand. Some knowledge Ellis had written does not live in wires. It lives in attention. Reed stopped there and looked around the cabin, the table, the stove, the radio desk, the patched roof above him. The place felt less empty with every line. The money, Ellis explained, was his savings. Small paychecks, quiet years, little spending, and the sale of an old trailer when he left the valley. $42,000, set aside not for the county and not for anyone who came looking only to take. If you need it to live, Ellis wrote, use it to live. A man trying to stand again should not be ashamed of accepting a hand from someone already gone. But if you have strength left, keep Granite Pass standing one more winter. If you cannot do that, then at least keep the names. A place is not gone while someone remembers who worked there. Reed read the last paragraph 3 times. A place does not lose its worth because people stop visiting. A man does not lose his worth because people stop asking his name. The words did not strike him all at once. They moved slowly, like warmth from the stove, finding the cold places he had stopped admitting were cold. He thought of the laundromat parking lot, of lowered voices, of coffee cups counted against his last bills, of people seeing the truck before they saw him. Ash lifted his head and placed it gently on Reed's thigh. Reed rested one hand between the dog's ears and looked at the cabinet, the letter, the money, the roof he had patched before turning the key. For the first time since buying Granite Pass, he understood that the station had not simply been waiting to be opened. It had been waiting to be answered. Reed did not leave Granite Pass with the money. That was the first decision, and the quietest one. He counted the bundles once more, because a man who had been down to $25 does not trust a number like 42,000 without touching it, then wrapped most of it back in wax paper and sealed it inside an old metal ammunition box he found under the radio desk. He locked the box, wrapped it in oilcloth, and hid it beneath a loose floorboard under the bunk frame, not because he thought anyone was coming, but because money that large made a room feel different if it sat in the open. He kept only what he needed, folded inside his wallet with the county receipt, and before sunrise the next morning, he and Ash walked back down toward Larch Creek. The road seemed longer going down, maybe because now every mile had a purpose. Reed bought like a man afraid of wasting a dead man's trust: nails, roof sealant, glass, stovepipe, rice, beans, coffee, batteries, lamp oil, insulation, dog food, and a thin foam mattress wrapped in plastic. At the hardware store, Dale Mercer watched him carry the supplies to the counter with one eyebrow raised. Dale was a square-built man with a beard trimmed close and the habit of speaking as if every sentence had already been measured against profit. "You really fixing that place up?" he asked. Reed set a box of hinges beside the nails, trying to. Dale looked over the items. "That station hasn't mattered since before half this town had cell service." Reed did not answer. He had learned that silence saved more strength than pride did. After a moment, he held up two hinge packs. "Which one handles cold better?" Dale stared at him, then pointed to the heavier set. "Those, if the frame isn't rotten." "Frame's not gone yet," Reed said. Dale gave a small shake of his head, but he rang up the better hinges. That became the pattern. Reed came down early, bought what he could carry, ate the cheapest hot meal at Marin Cole's diner, and climbed back up before the light left the trees. Marin noticed the first time he came in with mud up to his knees and Ash sleeping under the table, too tired even to watch the door. She put a plate of eggs, toast, and potatoes in front of him, though he had ordered only coffee and soup. "Kitchen made extra," she said. It was not true, but she said it plainly enough that Reed did not argue. He paid what he could and left 2 folded dollar bills under the cup. The trips were hard in ways that never sounded impressive when spoken out loud. One afternoon, halfway up the trail, sleet came down fast and sharp, ticking against the wrapped glass strapped to Reed's pack. He sat beneath a ponderosa pine with the panes held across his chest like something alive. His fingers curled around the edges until the storm passed. Ash stood in front of him, ice clinging to his coat, facing the trail as if keeping weather itself from coming closer. Another day, the rolled mattress caught on every branch, pulled Reed backward twice, and made his bad shoulder burn so fiercely he had to stop every few hundred yards. Ash would trot ahead, realize Reed had fallen behind, then return and wait without impatience, eyes steady, breath steaming in the cold air. At Granite Pass, change came slowly enough that a stranger might not have noticed at first. But Reed noticed. The floor stopped feeling gritty under his boots. The west window opened after he worked oil into the swollen frame. The stove drew cleaner with the new pipe. The roof still leaked in 2 corners, but not in the center. The steel cabinet stood upright now, wiped free of dust. He cleaned the map table until old knife marks and ink stains appeared beneath the grime. He put Ash's bowl under the porch, where meltwater would not drip into it. He drove a hook into the wall beside the door for the gray harness, then stood looking at it longer than a hook deserved. A thing had a place now. That mattered. He found a few used books in Larch Creek and carried them up one at a time. Montana weather patterns, cabin repair, a road atlas with half the pages loose, a thin history of mountain survey crews. He placed them on the empty shelf, Not because 4 books made a library, but because an empty shelf asked to be answered. In the evenings, after the light left the clearing, Reed read Ellis Rowan's old logs and began keeping his own. Wind from the northwest. Morning temperature 34. Creek running clear. Deer tracks near shed. Ash woke at 2:10 and watched the tree line. Some entries were hardly worth ink, and still he wrote them. The day had shape when it was written down. His life had shape. Weeks earlier, Reed's mornings had begun with fogged truck windows, and the question of where he could sit without being asked to move. Now they began with the stove, the creek, the roof, the dog, the trail, the work waiting in plain sight. Nothing about Granite Pass was easy. Winter was coming down the ridges, visible now in white patches that lasted longer each morning. Reed could feel it in the wood, in the water, in the way Ash lifted his nose toward the north. He did not know if the cabin would hold. He did not know if he would. But each night, when he closed the door and heard the wind stay outside a little better than it had the night before, he felt something inside him fasten back into place, one small repair at a time. By the 3rd month, Granite Pass had stopped looking abandoned from a distance, though only just. The roof still carried patches of mismatched tin. The porch still leaned if a man looked at it from the wrong angle. The shed still sagged toward the trees as if tired of standing. But smoke rose from the stovepipe most mornings now, thin and blue against the cold Montana sky, and the west window caught sunlight instead of holding dust. That was enough for Larch Creek to notice. Word moved the way it always did in small towns, through hardware counters, diner booths, gas pumps, and men who claimed not to care while asking 3 questions too many. Reed heard pieces of it when he came down for supplies. Some said he had found a way to live rent-free. Some said he was hiding from something. And some said no sane man would spend winter at Granite Pass. Reed let the words pass by him like wind through pine. He had work waiting. One afternoon, as he was fitting a new latch onto the woodshed door, Ash lifted his head from the porch and stared down the trail. A man appeared a few minutes later wearing expensive boots already smeared with trail mud, a dark wool coat too clean for the climb, and leather gloves too fine for the weather. He was breathing harder than he wanted Reed to notice. "Reed Sutter?" he asked. Reed set the screwdriver on the step. "That's right." The man smiled with practiced warmth. "Brent Halverson. I handle land and rural parcels around Park County and a few places west of here." Ash stood and moved beside Reed without a sound. Brent glanced at the dog, then at the cabin, then at the patched roof, and Reed saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Not admiration. Appraisal. Brent walked a slow half-circle in the clearing, careful not to step in the soft mud near the drainage trench. "You've done more here than I expected," he said. Most people would have walked away after seeing the road. Reed said nothing. Brent took that as permission to continue. County may revisit the old hiking route next year. A place like this could become useful if someone had capital and the right contacts. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "I can offer you $3,000 for the parcel, cashier's check, fast closing, no complications." Reed looked at the paper but did not take it. $3,000 was not nothing. It was a room somewhere warm for a while. It was repairs on the pickup. It was a winter with fewer risks. Brent seemed to sense the thought pass through him. His voice softened, but only on the surface. "Look, I'm not trying to insult you. A man in your position should think practically. Take the money, rent a decent room in town, get your feet under you." His eyes moved over Reed's old coat, the patched sleeve, the mud on his knees, the dog's worn harness hanging by the door. Then he said it lightly, as if it were kindness. "A man living out of a truck should not tie himself to a mountain. The clearing went very quiet. Reed felt the sentence land not like a blow, but like cold water finding the inside of a boot. He had heard worse. What made this one stay was not cruelty. It was certainty. Brent believed poverty gave him the right to decide what Reed was allowed to love. Ash stepped forward until his shoulder touched Reed's leg. He did not bark. He only looked at Brent with a stillness that made the man fold the paper a little tighter. Reed picked up the screwdriver again. Granite Pass isn't for sale. Brent waited, perhaps expecting more anger, explanation, a speech. Reed gave him none. After a moment, Brent laughed once under his breath and looked up at the roof. "You'll change your mind when real snow comes." "Maybe," Reed said, "but not today." Brent's smile thinned. He put the paper back into his coat and started down the trail, stepping carefully around the mud, already done with the place now that it had refused to become profit. Reed watched until the trees took him. Then he went inside, opened the steel cabinet, and took out Ellis Rowan's letter. He did not read it because he needed courage. He read it because some words were tools, and a man used the right tool when something inside him had been knocked loose. That evening, when Reed came down to Larch Creek for supplies, Marin Cole had a sack waiting near the diner counter, coffee, old newspapers, and a small bag of dried beans. Reed reached for his wallet. Marin shook her head. "Tell me next time what the valley looks like from up there." Reed looked at her, unsure what to do with gentleness that did not ask him to shrink. "I can do that," he said. Back at Granite Pass, he found a folder behind the lower shelf of the cabinet, filled with names written in Ellis's careful hand. Snow watchers, radio operators, road hands, plow drivers, marker crews, none famous, none rich, but each one had stood somewhere cold and kept a road safer than it would have been without them. Reed placed the list on the table and rested his palm beside it. Outside, Ash circled once on the porch and lay down facing the trail. Granite Pass was not for sale, and for the first time in months, Reed felt certain of something. Winter did not arrive at Granite Pass like a storm in a story. It came by inches. Frost stayed longer in the grass, water wore ice by morning, and the trail lost its brown edges under snow that no longer melted by noon. Then one evening the sky lowered. The wind turned clean and hard out of the north, and the first true snow began to fall without hurry, as if it had all winter to finish burying the world. By dark, the porch steps were gone. By midnight, the trees had become white shapes beyond the window. The cabin creaked under the weight, not loudly but steadily, like an old ship taking pressure from a cold sea. Reed lay awake on the narrow bed with one arm under his head, listening to the roof, the stove, the wind testing every seam he had patched. Ash slept near the door, but not deeply. One ear lifted whenever the cabin spoke. Reed had prepared as well as a man could prepare with limited money, borrowed tools, and a place that had been neglected for 20 years. Firewood stacked under the shed roof, rice and beans in sealed tins, coffee wrapped tight, water filtered and stored, extra tarp folded behind the stove, roof braces cut and wedged into place. But preparation did not make winter gentle. It only gave a man a chance to meet it standing. Before dawn on the third morning of heavy snow, Ash came to the bed and pressed his cold nose into Reed's hand. Not once, again. Then he stepped back and looked toward the rear wall of the cabin. Reed opened his eyes, still thick with sleep, and knew from the dog's silence that something was wrong. Ash did not bark when the matter was serious. He insisted. Reed pulled on his boots, coat, and gloves, then followed him outside into air so cold it seemed to empty his lungs before filling them. Behind the cabin, a large pine limb had come down in the night and fallen across the drainage trench he had cleared weeks before. Snow had packed around it. A thin rain had begun to mix with the storm, strange and dangerous. turning the top layer heavy. Already, water was gathering against the north foundation, dark and slow under the snow. Reed stood still just long enough to understand the shape of the problem. If the trench stayed blocked, the melt would push under the old wall. The floor would take water. The foundation could shift. Granite Pass might survive 20 years of abandonment, only to be lost in the first winter. Someone tried to love it again. He went to work. There was no audience, no one to call it brave. No one to clap when he dragged the hatchet from the shed and started cutting through frozen branches, with fingers going numb inside his gloves. Ash moved with him, digging at loose snow, grabbing smaller limbs in his teeth, pulling them away and returning for more. Reed's bad shoulder flared until pain ran down his arm, but he kept cutting. He chopped, dragged, cleared, kicked ice from the trench, then used the shovel to open a path downhill. At last the trapped water moved, not much at first, a dark thread under white, then more. It slipped around the cabin instead of into it, found the old channel, and ran toward the trees with the quiet sound of something saved. Reed leaned on the shovel, breathing hard, snow collecting on his sleeves. Ash stood beside the trench, tail low, watching the water as if judging whether the cabin would be allowed another day. Later, while clearing the shed after the storm, Ash nosed behind a crooked shelf and refused to leave it. Reed pulled the shelf aside and found a wooden box, small, plain, hidden more by time than secrecy. Inside were no more bundles of cash, only photographs, a faded county badge, folded thank you notes from road crews, and a small black notebook. The names inside were ordinary names. Truck drivers, snowplow operators, line repairmen, trail workers, a mail carrier who had waited in town because Granite Pass advised the pass closed. A delivery driver delayed one night before a slide came down across the road. Men and women who had gone home safely because someone at this station noticed what the mountain was about to do. Reed sat on an overturned crate and read until the light thinned. Then he understood the quietest truth of Granite Pass. When the station did its job, nothing happened. No wreck, no headline, no funeral, no story. Just people arriving home, hanging up coats, sleeping in their own beds, never knowing the name of the man who told them to wait. A few days later, Reed carried hand-copied pages from the old notebook down to Larch Creek. At Marin Cole's diner, he placed them on the counter while Ash settled under the stool. Marin read one page, then stopped at a name halfway down. Her face changed carefully, as if she did not want anyone to see the memory arrive. "That was my father's crew," she said. Reed waited. Marin turned another page, then another. She did not thank him in a large voice. She did not make the moment public. She simply put a hot plate in front of him and said, "Bring more next time." Reed looked down at the food, then at the old pages between them. For once, what he felt from her was not pity for the man who had slept in a truck. It was respect for the man who had carried a forgotten piece of the mountain back into town. A year later, Granite Pass was still hard to reach, and Reed preferred it that way. No sign promised scenic views, no tour map marked the station, and no weekend crowd climbed up with cameras and paper cups. The trail still crossed wet stone and narrow creek bends. The wind still came hard through the pass. In winter, snow still erased the last mile as if the mountain wanted every visitor to prove they meant it. But Granite Pass was no longer dead. That was the difference. The roof held through rain now. The windows were clean enough to catch sunrise. The stove drew steady and clean, sending a thin line of smoke into the cold Montana air most mornings. The map table, once gray with dust, was wiped every week until the old scratches showed like handwriting. The steel cabinet no longer stood in the corner like a locked warning. Helen had helped him file copies of the public records with the library, while the originals stayed at Granite Pass, in the place Ellis had meant them to be kept. The cabinet held Ellis Rowan's letter, the snow logs, the avalanche maps, the photographs Reed and Ash had found, the list of men and women who had kept the pass safe, and Reed's own weather journals filling slowly, page by page. Beside the door, Ash's gray harness hung from a hook. Reed had driven into the wall with more care than the job required. Under the porch sat the dog's water bowl, a stack of split wood, and a rough chair Reed had made from boards that once sagged inside the shed. The money Ellis left did not make Reed rich in the way people usually meant. Reed would not have known what to do with that kind of rich anyway. He used it carefully. Some went toward food, tools, roofing, glass, stove parts, and winter gear. Some stayed sealed away for the seasons Granite Pass would still demand, and some became the Granite Watch Fund, a small, quiet thing filed under Ellis Rowan's name first and Reed's second. It bought radios, vests, flashlights, first aid kits, gloves, and batteries for road hands, trail crews, volunteer searchers, and plow drivers. Nobody held a banquet. Nobody cut a ribbon. That would have embarrassed the purpose out of it. In Larch Creek, the changes came slowly. Helen Ward at the library helped Reed find old county records, photographs, and hand-drawn route maps that had been boxed away in a basement room. Marin Cole cleared a small wall near the back booth of her diner and hung copies of the Granite Pass photographs there. Customers who had once walked past Reed, without meeting his eyes, now stopped to look at the names under the pictures. Dale Mercer still complained about the cost of everything, but he began setting aside better hardware when Reed came down the trail, charging less than the tag said and pretending not to notice. Brent Halverson never became a friend. Men like Brent did not change all at once. But the next time someone at the counter called Granite Pass a worthless shack, Brent only stirred his coffee and said, "It's standing, isn't it?" That was enough. Ash grew older that year. White spread farther along his muzzle, softening the sharp lines of his face, though his eyes stayed bright and serious. Each morning, he still walked with Reed to the measuring pole. Reed checked snow depth, wind direction, the creek level, the sky over the north ridge. Ash checked the ground, the shed, the tree line, the places Reed forgot to trust. Sometimes the dog paused in front of the steel cabinet and lifted his nose, as if remembering the day he had found the key beneath the floor. Reed would watch him and think of all the ways a life could turn on something small. A dog noticing what everyone else ignored, a note under a plank, a roof fixed before a lock opened, a letter written by a man who had trusted the future more than he trusted the county. On the first cold morning of the next winter, Reed stood on the porch with a tin cup of coffee warming his hands. Snow covered the pines. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. Far below, Larch Creek rested in the valley, small and pale, its rooftops barely visible through morning haze. Ash stood beside him in the weak sun, ears forward, body calm. Reed no longer slept behind the laundromat. His truck was parked under a lean-to now, repaired enough to start when asked. He had a bed, a stove, a table, a shelf of books, a dog bowl by the door, and work waiting each day. But he had not forgotten the cold windshield, the counted bills, the way people lowered their voices around a man they had already decided was finished. So when a tired stranger came up the trail one afternoon, soaked from rain and carrying more silence than gear, Reed did not ask what had gone wrong. He opened the door, poured coffee, pointed to the chair near the stove, and let the man sit down as a human being before he had to explain himself. Reed Sutter had bought Granite Pass Snow Station with his last $25. People thought he had bought rotten boards, bad road access, and a roof that would not last. But Ash had found what was locked inside. Not just $42,000, not just Ellis Rowan's letter, something steadier than luck. Proof that a place could be forgotten without losing its worth, and a man could be misjudged without losing his name. Granite Pass did not save Reed with a miracle. It saved him with work, with winter, with roofs to mend, logs to write, fires to start before dawn, and a loyal dog who saw value in him before the town remembered how. If Reed and Ash's story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe, so more stories like this can find their way to you. What part of Granite Pass stayed with you most? And where are you watching from tonight? Share it in the comments.